I am of Japanese descent, and each year I go to visit my family in the north of Japan, and also do the Obon, which is basically like Day of the Dead in Japan, when the spirits of the dead come and visit the land of the living. During this period, I decided to go visit Kyoto, and long story short, after walking for a while out of the city, I began climbing a nearby mountain to discover a substantially sized cemetery. Being a young lad of 16 at the time, I decided I'd go exploring and see which families were buried here. It was about 3 p.m. and it was scorching, and the trees scattered around the cemetery gave a welcoming shade for me to cool down a little bit. After around 10 minutes or so of looking about the old stone slabs, I realized a few odd details. First, it seems I somehow got lost in the cemetery. Mind you, I have an excellent sense of geolocalization and have found my way out of many a forest, mountains, and airports. The cemetery itself was lower in its middle parts and surrounded by woods. So, I think I was in the lower part because the horizon only revealed tombs. It was starting to get dark. As I said before, it was around 3 p.m, so that was very odd. And the surroundings had that yellowish tinge that you get at dusk. If I make a small cultural parenthesis here, dusk is called Tasogerodoki in Old Japanese, and it's supposed to be the in-between moment when strange things occur, sort of like the witching hour. Not a good time to be surrounded by tombs. I was also getting a little cold. Not like I was plunged into an icy pool, but more like when you're in the middle of the mountains and you can feel some coldness through the gaps of your coat. After that, I began seeing some weird shadows out of the corner of my eye. Very weird, because I wasn't feeling panicked or anything, and I could calmly observe them. It was moving like these old lava lamps, very deliberately, and sometimes looked a bit human in shape, or like huge faces. I was walking towards it, because I thought if it could harm me physically, I could certainly punch it. But it was fluttering, and almost mirage-like. After a while, I started to feel like I was in danger. I was getting colder and colder, and at that moment I saw a monk who was very surprised to see me there, because the cemetery was supposed to be closed at this hour. He took me back to the entrance, and I told him it was open when I got in. He informed me that he had been by the entrance all day and never saw me come in. I assumed that he thought I vaulted the wall or something, so I told him everything I saw and felt. He seemed very surprised at first, and then told me to look at the hour. It was 6:10 p.m. That means I was in there for over 3 hours. He told me I shouldn't come there whilst the sun was setting, and that I could have been taken away by the Kamikushi. Anyway, that was a very weird experience. The cemetery was east of Kyoto, near the Shogunzuwa Mountains. And just a word of caution to you all. It's best not to wander into Japanese cemeteries, because it's not a place for tourists, but of respect. Back when I was 22, my best friend of 13 years and I went to check out a cemetery that had reports of a crying statue one night. We parked my car at a local business, then walked up a steep hill to the cemetery to look for said statue. We wandered around for what seemed like 10 to 15 minutes, until we came across what we thought would be it. We saw no tears, but the face felt moist, and I thought that it would be nothing more than dew. Now it's past 1 AM, and we have no flashlights, but the cemetery is off a main road, so it's easy to see once your eyes adjust to the darkness. We continue to walk around until we get to a mausoleum. My friend, Kelly, was right in front of it, and I'm standing about 10 feet back just watching her. Here's where shit goes wrong. I see what I remember to be an almost 7-foot figure, clearly of a man, walk from a very tall tree to right past the mausoleum. When I yell run, and nope the hell out of there. Kelly said by the time she turned around to look at me, I was halfway out the cemetery. She frantically tried to ask me what I saw, and I couldn't say a word until I got back to my house, where she refused to stay after I told her. I saw a black silhouette of a very tall man. I couldn't make out any traits, except the direction it was looking at. It was completely black. After researching and talking to psychics, who's a woman, who asked me how my kidneys were before I even knew I had problems with them, I came to the conclusion that I saw a shadow person. The worst part is, I must have attracted it in a way that it followed me home. I've had the most unexplainable and terrifying stuff happen to me after coming home that night. Since doing so, I believe in true evil. I'm 28 years old, and I'm still being followed. This happened when I was 16 years old, so it's been almost 3 decades, but I still remember it clearly. That summer, I was spending a lot of time at my friend Matt's house. His parents had both moved out, but hadn't sold the house yet. So we had the place to ourselves 99.9% of the time. There were almost always friends over, and the night this took place, there were at least 5 to 6 of us there. We decided to visit a local cemetery late at night. I won't mention the name, because they have had huge problems with vandalism over the years, and the cemetery is basically off limits, save for relatives of the deceased. Knowing this, we dropped off our friends at the path into the cemetery, and then drove down the main road about a half mile and parked the car. Then Matt and I jogged back to meet them. They were already spooked, and the night had just got creepier from there. We made it up to the cemetery, but barely. It seemed the sounds were coming from everywhere around us. Granted, we were teenagers, so our senses were probably a little overworked, but it felt like we were being watched. Needless to say, we didn't last there long, and everyone came to a unanimous decision that they were too scared to stay. We jogged to the car and drove back to Matt's house, which was a good few miles away in a local neighborhood. Everyone was talking and having a good time, except me. I was a bit emotional. The backstory is long, but to sum it up, the girl I liked at the time liked Matt instead, and she was there that night. So to distance myself from the situation, I went outside to get some fresh air. This was probably at least midnight by then, so the night was quiet and still. I was standing in the street, just basically feeling sorry for myself, and hoping the privacy would allow some time to collect my thoughts, when I turned around and froze in place. There was a mist floating right in front of me. It didn't have a human shape per se, but it was tall and narrow, rather than fog, which tends to be low and wide. This was definitely something abnormal. It was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck and completely shut down my fight or flight mode. I was scared stiff. I was no more than 5 feet away. It was just floating there, and I didn't move. Neither did the thing. For what seemed like several minutes, I stood there staring at it, and finally, I turned around and ran back to the house. I immediately told my friends what had occurred, but when they went outside to look, it had vanished. I have no doubt, whatever this was, it had followed me or us from the cemetery. It was the most clearly paranormal experience I've ever had. I've seen many strange things in my life, and labelled many of them as paranormal, but there was normally always an uncertainty about it. In this experience, there was no doubt what I saw. I have always wanted to visit the cemetery again. However, as I got older, I gained more respect for not tromping onto private property, and learned to let sleeping dogs lie. Sometimes it's best not to stir up the dust on an old memory, and just remember it as it was.